The Mountain Sprite's Kingcom, a short story by Edward Knatchbull-Huggessen, published in 1881. It was a gorge, a very deep gorge in the side of a very large mountain, and it seemed for all the world as if some enormous giant, bigger than anybody has ever imagined, and more hungry than giants usually are, had mistaken the mountain for a gigantic plum cake, and cut out of it a tremendous hunch in order to satisfy his ravenous appetite. This, at least, was what it looked like when you first saw it from the waters of the lake below the mountain, and it was not until you got close to it that you found it was rather more than a slice which had been cut out, and that the giant must not only have been very hungry indeed, but must have cut his cake very oddly and very awkwardly. At the point where you would have expected to find the end of the slice, the gorge suddenly curved round to the right and left, and became two separate gorges, diving quite into the heart of the mountain, much further and much deeper than any giant would ever have been likely to cut. So I do not believe the story of the giant at all, and I cannot advise the children to do so either. Perhaps the gorge was made by the waters of the blue lake below, only it does not seem as if they could ever have got high enough to make it. Perhaps an avalanche of snow from the top of the higher mountains came down and cut out the gorge by the force of its weight, or perhaps the fairies and mountain sprites did it all for their own amusement, some day when they had nothing better to do. After all, this is the most likely perhaps, because those mountains were said to be full of sprites and fairies, and that is the reason why I am going to tell you something about them. Some people, of course, will tell you that it is all nonsense, and that there are no such things as sprites and fairies, but then those are the people who do not like the children to make a noise, and are always grave and quiet and wise themselves, and to such people fairies do not care to come, and therefore, as they never see them, it is perhaps natural that they should not believe in their existence. But those who read this little story will see at once that there must be fairies and sprites, because otherwise the things of which I am going to tell you could never really have happened. And if these things had never happened, how could old Carl the Woodman have ever told them to me so that I could write them down for the children to read? It was not so very long ago, either, though I forgot to ask the exact date, but I know it was in the days when England was an island, and English people could not come to the continent of Europe without crossing the sea in a ship or boat. So you see, things have not changed so very greatly, and if we knew the whole truth, there may be fairies and all kinds of wonderful beings at this very moment in the place which was the scene of my story. Old Carl was at work in the gorge, cutting wood to carry down to the big hotel at the foot of the mountain, as he had done for several years past, in fact, ever since the hotel had been built, to provide lodging for the travelers who had been coming, every year in greater numbers, to see the beautiful lake and the snow-crowned mountains which hovered over it like guardian spirits. In this particular year, more strangers than ever seemed to have arrived, and everything was bustle and confusion in the hotel and down by the shores of the lake, where several people had begun to build lodging houses to attract the wanderers. But, higher up in the mountains, all was quiet enough. The magpies who frequented the woods on each side of the gorge, had it pretty much all to themselves, except when a journeying rook broke in upon their lazy chattering with his business-like caw as he passed by, or a large hawk, on his search for prey, hovered over the ravine for an instant, and then soared away over the high mountains, with a haughty disdain for birds who could not fly as high as he himself could. All, I say, was quiet, and old Carl went on chopping his wood and minding his own business, which is a very good thing for everybody to do, and generally prevents people from getting into trouble. Chop, 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 went the old man, and was getting on capitally with his day's work, when he was suddenly interrupted by the sound of voices, which being a very unusual sound at that particular place, caused him to stop and listen in some surprise at the interruption. Yes, voices they undoubtedly were, and young voices, too, merry voices into the bargain, and with the voices came laughter, bright, pleasant laughter, such as comes from hearts upon which the cares of the world have not yet begun to press heavily. They came nearer and nearer, up the little path which Carl himself had followed to reach the spot where he was at work, and before he had time to wonder much longer at the unexpected sounds, the owners of the voices came in sight, close to him, walking along the path straight to the place where the old man stood. They were two persons, a boy and a girl, and it was at once evident to Carl that they were strangers, no doubt the children of some of those travelers from distant lands of whom I have just spoken. The boy seemed to be about 14, tall and strong for his age, well built, with an honest, open face, and a joyous expression upon it as if he had come out to be pleased with everything and meant to be so too. His sister, for such she evidently was, seemed to be about a year younger, She was of a fair complexion, with light brown hair and blue eyes, and though she was unlike her brother in features, there was the same joyous expression, which told of a guileless, happy nature, untainted by the coldness and hardness which advancing years too often bring with them. The brother and sister appeared to be on the best possible terms, and came laughing and singing along towards old Carl, whom they saw for the first time as they turned the corner of the path and came close upon him. "Hurrah!" shouted the boy, as soon as he saw the old woodcutter. "Here is an old man who will be able to tell us all we want to know, if we can only make him understand." And forthwith the boy began to question Carl about the place they were in, where the path led to, how far it was to the top of the mountain, and whether there were not splendid views to be seen higher up. Now all this was information very useful to a traveler, and very desirable to be acquired by such, but in this case there was a little difficulty in the matter, inasmuch as the young questioner spoke in a language which old Carl could by no means understand. Fortunately, however, the lady was, as ladies not unfrequently are, the means of making things go smoothly. Although Carl could not understand her language, she, having been a good girl, and always attentive to her governess, as good girls invariably are, knew some of his sufficiently to make him understand what her brother was asking him, and to interpret his reply. This, it must be confessed, was not favorable to their further progress. The old woodcutter honestly told them that the path was steep and difficult, and moreover expressed his own belief that the side of the mountain was inhabited by so many wonderful and powerful spirits, of one kind or another, that it was by no means safe for mortals to travel upon it. But the children only laughed at these wise words, and said that they did so long to see the beautiful view which they knew there must be from the mountains that they were determined to go on. The old man shook his head gravely, but it was none of his business to stop them, and if he had wished to do so ever so much, I do not think he would have succeeded. This was probably his own opinion too, so after standing still for a few seconds, watching the two gay young creatures as they went on their way, he resumed his work, and went steadily on with it until it was time to go home. I do not suppose he thought much more about the children after they had left him. When the proper time came he stopped work, shouldered his axe, left his faggots tied up according to his custom, and marched slowly down the mountain to his little cottage, where his old wife greeted him kindly, and they had their usual pleasant gossip over all that they had to gossip about, which was, after all, very little. The old man was not likely to have picked up much news upon the mountainside, where there was nobody to talk to, and in listening to the scraps of information which his wife had gathered during her journey to the village below, where she had been, according to custom, to buy sundry household necessaries, he quite forgot to tell her of the only adventure which had actually happened to him, namely, his interview with the two young creatures. So the evening passed away quietly enough, and the worthy couple retired to rest at their usual time, troubled by few cares, and having before them the calm prospect of a long succession of similarly tranquil and uneventful days. This prospect, however, was destined to be interrupted in a manner which neither of them could by any possibility have expected. The morrow, indeed, dawned as fair as ever. The morning sun lighted up the woody sides of the mountain with his cheerful rays, the placid waters of the lake below reflected his grandeur in the heavens above, the fresh air filled every breathing creature with new life and vigor, and every human being capable of enjoying existence blessed in his heart the Creator who had made so glorious a world for his creatures to live in. Old Carl was astir betimes, and, shouldering his axe, marched steadily up the hill to the place where his usual work was to be performed. Although his limbs were aged, his heart felt young and light and glad on that beautiful morning, and his strokes fell upon the trees like the strokes of a youthful and vigorous man, so inspiriting was the delicious air of his native mountains, and so invigorating the breath of the glorious morning. He worked on steadily till towards midday, and then, as upon the day before, he heard voices, but voices of less musical and pleasant tones than those which had then fallen upon his ears. They were the voices of men, of excited and angry men, speaking in loud and fierce accents, and at first he could not understand what they meant. "Where is he?" cried one voice. "Where is the murderer?" And another chimed in with words of the same sort. "Where is the old rascal who decoys and kills innocent children?" Carl turned himself round as he heard these words, wondering what they could mean, and never for one moment suspecting that they were intended to apply to himself. He was, however, soon undeceived. The speakers were rapidly approaching the spot on which he stood, and as he leaned upon his axe and faced the path which led from the village up the mountain, He saw some 20 peasants crowding together and hurrying up, and perceived at once that it was from them that had proceeded the words which he had heard. As to the person for whom they were intended, he was not long left in doubt, for, no sooner had they caught sight of the old woodcutter, than their cries redoubled, and they rushed upon him with such haste and vehemence, that it seemed as if they were about to destroy him. Meanwhile, as they all spoke at once, and in very loud tones, the old man found some difficulty at first in understanding what they meant. In fact, before he had discovered this, he was hustled this way and that, his hat knocked off, his axe taken from him, and such cuffs and shakings inflicted upon him, that he began to think his neighbors had all suddenly gone mad. For they were his neighbors beyond all doubt. There was Pierre the cobbler, the greatest gossip of the village, and Jacques the tailor, and Jean-Baptiste the orange seller, and half a dozen more people with whom he had lived on friendly terms for the best part of his life, but who now seemed prompted by some strange and unaccountable desire to tear him to pieces. It was vain to struggle against such numbers, and the old man did not attempt it. But, after the first violence of his assailants had subsided, he managed with some difficulty to stammer forth the words, "What have I done, my masters, that ye use me thus?" Instantly they recommenced a babel of cries which were scarcely as yet intelligible to the ancient woodcutter, until at last he found that they resolved themselves principally into the question, which he could have answered much more readily if he had been allowed to hear it at first: "Where are the strange children? What have you done with the little ones?" When he comprehended that which was asked of him, Karl was none the less surprised at the personal attack to which he had been subjected, for as we know very well, though the simple peasants were ignorant of it, the old man had not only done the children no harm whatever, but had seen them but for a few moments, and held with them the most innocent and friendly conversation. "The children," he said, as soon as he could make his voice heard. "What children?" The words were scarcely out of his mouth when his persecutors broke out again with their angry and incoherent cries. "He pretends not to know, the old villain. Doubtless he has murdered the pretty innocents, and hidden away their bodies in some ravine. Pierre saw them going up the path towards the place where he was at work. They have never come down. What is clearer? What more certain? Oh! The old rascal, Karl, whom we all thought so quiet and respectable. Throw him down. Tear him in pieces. The child slayer. The wretch." From these and similar exclamations, the woodcutter soon perceived that he was suspected of having decoyed away and murdered the 2 young people who had visited him upon the previous day, and, being perfectly innocent of any such offense, he felt at once indignant at being suspected thereof, and confident that his innocence could and would without difficulty be proved. If, however, the persons before him should proceed to inflict the summary punishment which they now threatened by voice and gesture, his innocence would avail him but little. Therefore, being a man not devoid of common sense, he perceived that his first object must be to escape from the then present danger, and he forthwith proceeded to make the attempt. "It is false," he cried. "I am as innocent as any of you. Take me to the mayor." He could not have spoken more wisely for his own purposes. The people who threatened him were of an excitable race, whose passions were easily roused and who might commit excesses of violence in their exasperation. But they were not an unjust or cruel people. They loved fair play, and when reminded that there was a law by which the criminal, if criminal he were, could surely be punished, they gave up at once the idea of taking that law into their own hands. "He speaks well," they cried. "So be it, take him to the mayor. To the mayor with the old sinner." And without more ado Karl was hurried down the mountainside in the direction of the village. Before he reached his destination, however, he had to encounter a worse ordeal than that which he had already passed through. At the very entrance of the village a number of peasant women met him, whose violence, both of gesture and language, was greater than that of the men. They called him every name they could lay their tongues to, accused him of the murder of the 2 children, and hinted this was by no means his first crime, whilst some went so far as to declare that his wife was probably as bad as he was, and that both of them ought to be made an end of at once. To all this abuse Karl made no reply, and in due time the tongues of his revilers were hushed, and the old woodcutter was ushered into the presence of the mayor, and for the first time learned the exact nature and full extent of the crime with which he was charged. It appeared that an English family had arrived, 2 days before, at one of the large hotels upon the edge of the lake, intending to remain there for some little time. The day after their arrival, the youthful son and daughter of the family, Lionel and Ethel Newton, had sallied forth to explore the mountains after the fashion, from time immemorial, of restless and curious English youth. They had been seen walking through the village, and Pierre, the cobbler, who had happened to have been that day higher up the mountain than usual, had met them, and declared that they were then going direct to the spot at which old Carl the woodcutter was working. Since that time they had disappeared, and no trace whatever could be found of them, although their disconsolate parents had made every inquiry. In these circumstances, however, there was nothing so absolutely to attract suspicion to the old woodcutter as to justify the energetic and somewhat hasty proceedings of the villagers. Why, then, and at whose direction, had these proceedings been taken? This was the mysterious part of the story, and herein again was Pierre the cobbler one of the most important witnesses. This worthy man, against whose character no one had ever averred aught save to the effect that he was a bit of a gossip, solemnly declared that at a later hour in the afternoon than that at which he had seen the two missing ones upon the mountain, in fact, when the shades of evening were first wrapping the hillside in obscurity, and objects could be only indistinctly seen, he had seen and heard that which filled him with alarm and dismay. While sitting at his window, which commanded a view of the path from the village to the mountain, and musing, as he said, upon things in general, he had heard sounds of sobbing and weeping, which evidently proceeded from the hillside. Casting his eyes up, he perceived two shadowy, misty forms, flitting rather than walking through the fast-rising mist, and in another instant, as they passed close to his window, he distinctly recognized the figures of the very boy and girl whom he had met upon the mountainside. Pale they were, paler than when he had met them, but they wore precisely the same dresses, and were, beyond all doubt, the same brother and sister whom he had seen. And as they passed rapidly by, he heard them, as plainly as he had ever heard anybody in his life, lamenting and bewailing some misfortune of the nature and extent of which he would have been profoundly ignorant, had not the two figures stayed their course for one moment just when they had passed his house, and uttered the following words on to the other in mournful tones, which, as Pierre protested, seemed to pierce down into his very heart: "Oh, brother dear, how wretched is our doom to perish thus so far away from home. Yes, sister, who so sad as you and I, by axe of cruel woodcutter to die?" On hearing these words and seeing the two figures, Pierre was, as he said, overwhelmed with astonishment, but, being sufficiently wise to know that if he were to disclose what he had seen and heard without due caution, he might be accused either of dealing with supernatural beings, as these doubtless were, or of having had something to do with the misfortune which had fallen upon the brother and sister, he said nothing at the moment. This might perhaps have arisen from another cause besides that of wisdom, for Pierre, being a bachelor and living alone, had no one to whom he could have spoken upon the matter, however much he might have wished it, without leaving his house, and to do this he had no inclination. But when, later on in the evening, word came from the hotel that the two young people were missing, it soon transpired that other persons beside Pierre had seen the figures and heard something of the same sort as had come to his ears, and thus it was that suspicion began to point towards old Carl the woodcutter. It was not, however, until the next morning that the people began to lay their heads together and to compare notes, and hence the delay which caused it to be well nigh midday before the old man was interrupted at his work, and presently dragged down to the village and carried before the mayor. By this functionary he was sternly questioned, and told all he knew without any concealment. This, however, had but little effect in calming the anger of the people or turning their suspicions in any other direction. To their minds the evidence was quite conclusive. The two lost children had been seen going to the place where Carl had been at work, they had never been seen again, and the mysterious figures which had appeared in the village had beyond all doubt been the spirits of the brother and sister, who had been permitted to return to earth in order that their murderer might be discovered, and his abominable crime meet with well-merited punishment. To the simple villagers the matter seemed to admit of no question whatever, and had their opinion been fully given and as freely taken, Carl would probably have been executed without delay. Fortunately for him, however, matters were ordered in a somewhat more regular form, and no such rough and ready proceeding was attempted. The mayor, indeed, frowned upon him a good deal, interrupted him a good deal more, when he tried to answer the questions which were asked him, one after the other, with great rapidity, and succeeded in frightening him not a little. But no bodily injury was inflicted upon him, and when the examination had been concluded, the old man was only told that he would in due time be tried for the offense of which he was accused, and that meanwhile he would be kept in safe custody. Accordingly, he was hurried off, amid the hootings and revilings of those who had up to so recent a period been his friends and neighbors, and was taken down to the prison which was deemed the strongest and most secure for the safekeeping of so terrible a malefactor. In fact, it was the only prison which that neighborhood possessed, for there were but few crimes committed there, and small necessity for making provision for the detention of criminals. An old, very old, castle stood actually in the lake, being connected with the mainland by an ancient drawbridge, and entered by means of huge, old-fashioned gates which might well be supposed by the simple-minded to be the production of some wizard or magician, so ponderous and strong did they appear, and with such strange and fantastic figures were they carved and ornamented. Beneath this castle were strange old dungeons, concerning which many wonderful legends were told, and which were visited, many a time and oft, by the curious stranger, who generally appeared to think that he knew a great deal more about the place than the guide who conducted him. But the peasants and fishermen who lived on the borders of the lake seldom or never passed within the castle walls, and few of them would have cared to enter the dungeons, even in broad daylight. Old Karl had never done so, and he felt his blood run cold, first, when he was pushed along through the castle gates and heard the grating lock turned harshly behind him, and still more when he was roughly thrust into one of the aforesaid dungeons, a loaf of brown bread, and a stone pitcher, filled with water, placed in the corner thereof, and the door closed upon him by the hand of the keeper of the place. Left alone to his meditations, the old man felt at first quite bewildered and confused, and whilst he is in this state it will be desirable that we should take this favorable opportunity of going back in our narration of this true and rational history, and endeavor to relate what had actually become of the two young persons of whose murder the old woodcutter had been accused. When Lionel and Ethel Newton had left the old man, they marched gaily forward along the path which led up the mountain, talking and laughing as they went, and expecting soon to come upon some magnificent view which would amply repay them for the trouble of the ascent. But, as a matter of fact, the higher they climbed, the less view did they obtain. The reason of this was very clear. At the lower part of the mountain, as the path turned and wound along the hillside, there were certainly beautiful views to be had from time to time. You could peep through the trees, and here and there, looking back, you saw the lake lying far below you, in its silent majesty, the glorious mountains surrounding it on either side, and the white outlines of the large villages which had sprung up around it glistening in the sunshine and relieving the eye as it glanced from the deep blue waters of the lake to rest upon them, and the vineyards beneath which they nestled, and which seemed to creep up the foot of the mountain like fortifications built there to defend the frontier against all comers. But the higher you ascended the mountain, and the more turns of the path you followed, thicker of course grew the leafy screen which interposed itself between you and the view, and at last our two travelers arrived at a point from which there was very little to be seen except wood and mountain. Back, to their left hand, sank the gorge, thickly wooded, and with such tall trees that they could no longer see over them to the lake. Immediately before them frowned the dark woods, which seemed to reach up to the very top of the hill, and that top, alas, appeared very little nearer than when they had first begun the ascent. They stopped for a moment, and took counsel together what they should do. Immediately before them was the course of a mountain torrent which crossed the path. It was tolerably dry at that time of year, though no doubt after snow or heavy rain it would have been impossible to cross it. Beyond it, the path seemed to wind on just as it had hitherto done, and the woods to grow thicker, or at least to be no less thick, than those through which they had already passed. But immediately to their right there appeared to be a kind of half-path, which was neither more nor less than the dry bed of that self-same torrent, which, for reasons best known to itself, had at some time or other changed its course, or of some other equally respectable torrent, which had become tired of being a torrent, or had left that particular spot to go and be a torrent somewhere else. This dry bed was full of pebbles and stones, with big rocks here and there on one side of it, and here and there jagged roots of great trees, now a large patch of firs growing as happily as if it was in a quiet, peaceful English wood, now a large slope of nyas, looking as soft and comfortable as moss does look sometimes, but, between moss and fern, roots, rocks, and trees, you could make out the bed of the torrent, which evidently came from some spot very near the top of the mountain, and which would consequently lead the traveler who followed it to that desirable place. Lionel and Ethel had seated themselves upon the trunk of a fallen tree in order to look around them and decide what route they should take, and for a few moments neither of them spoke. It was a wild, romantic scene. The dark trees above and below, the torrent trickling carelessly down the mountainside, as if with a consciousness of innate strength, which it didn't care to use then, but which it could use if it liked, and would, too, if occasion should require it, the dry bed of the old torrent, reminding one of the strength which had once been exerted, but which was now past and gone, and had only left behind it the token and memory of what it was, a mute parody upon the might and strength of man, the deep, silent gorge at their feet, the wood-crowned heights above their head, all was calculated to strike with awe and reverence the heart of the mortal who found himself in such a wild and sublime spot. I do not think, however, that either awe or reverence were precisely the feelings which affected our two travelers at this particular moment. They were both sufficiently tired to find a few minutes' rest the reverse of unpleasant, but neither of them had the slightest wish to abandon their project of reaching the top of the mountain and seeing the glorious view which they knew must be there to be seen. Still, the difficulties had proved greater than they had anticipated, and they felt less sure than when they started of being able to accomplish the task which they had set themselves to perform. Before they had sat still very long, they both came to the same conclusion, namely, that the regular path would never lead them to the top of the mountain, or at least not without such numerous turnings and windings as would very considerably lengthen the journey. Then came the question, would it be possible to make use of the dry bed of the torrent? It seemed steeper, to be sure, and would be less easy to climb than the regular path. Nevertheless, it could be climbed, and was not so very bad after all. Then, there were rocks and roots on which they could rest from time to time, and it certainly seemed to be a short cut to the top of the mountain. Indeed, when they looked up, they saw what appeared to be the top, and perceived also that the torrent bed seemed to run exactly in the right direction to reach it. True, there was a dark bit of wood to pass through, so dark and thick that they could not make sure of its length. But there was one bit of green on the top above the wood, of green grass apparently, growing close to certain crags and rocks, and all this they could see beyond the wood. It was a feat to perform, but it was possible to perform it, and what a triumph to go home with the story that they had climbed to the very top, and had seen the grandest view that was to be seen from the mountain. So, after a short consultation, they left their seat, quitted the main path, and resolutely began to ascend by the new way which they had chosen. Their progress, as may be supposed, was neither easy nor rapid. It would have been a steep ascent, even had it been up a smooth and well-made path, and it was anything but that. The large pebbles had a knack of turning under the foot of the climber, as if specially bent on spraining his ankle. The larger pieces of rock were not always firm enough to be trodden on with safety, and the moss was uncommonly slippery, and must be dealt with cautiously. However, the brother and sister were not to be stopped by trifles. Little by little they pushed their way on, higher and higher, encouraging each other as they went, and their hopes of eventual success rising rapidly each moment. At one time the torrent bed was quite open, with no trees within several yards of it, and exposed to the rays of the sun in a manner which made one wonder how it had ever been anything else than a dry bed. Then it passed in under shelving banks, down under the very roots of the great trees by its side, and became quite an underground passage, just for all the world as if it had been excavated by human hands. Still Lionel and Ethel pushed bravely on, and presently approached the spot at which the wood appeared denser and thicker, and above which they had been able to see nothing from their resting place below save the green and the rock on the crest of the hill far beyond. The brother and sister had got within a few yards of this spot, when their attention was suddenly arrested by an unexpected sound. A low, curious chuckle it was, as if someone had been intensely amused by a joke, or a funny thought, and was giving vent to his amusement in this not uncommon manner. At home, or at the hotel, or anywhere else among their companions and fellow creatures there would have been nothing extraordinary in the sound, but it was widely different when it was heard high up upon the mountains, and issued from woods which, without exaggeration, might be called gloomy. Beings who chuckle in such places do not always do it for amusement, and may be laughing at instead of with the traveler who hears them. It is not, therefore, surprising that the sound which reached the ears of the brother and sister by no means tended to incline them to join in a similar sound of merriment. They stopped and looked at each other with a puzzled air for a moment, and each seemed to think that the noise must have proceeded from the other, when it was repeated, not from one but apparently from many throats, and it really appeared as if the wood was full of merry people whose profession was chuckling, and who thoroughly understood the business. From every side, above, below, right and left, came the same sounds, and after the interval of a few seconds, during which Lionel and Ethel stared at each other with speechless astonishment, the chuckle changed into a laugh. and the whole mountainside seemed to ring with peal upon peal of laughter, not pleasant, kindly, jovial laughter such as one hears round the fireside at Christmas time, or after dinner in a country house with a cheery host who cracks his jokes with his filberts, but harsh, cruel, mocking, gibing laughter, as of someone with hard heart and savage eyes watching the sufferings of some other creature and gloating over them with malicious pleasure. Such were the sounds which fell upon the ears of the now frightened pair, and Ethel nestled up as close as she could to Lionel, while they both peered eagerly round in the hope of discovering whence these strange sounds proceeded. The attempt, however, was vain, and still the sounds continued, and rather seemed to increase than to abate in volume and vehemence. This lasted for certainly more than a minute, perhaps for two, and then all of a sudden there occurred something of a still more extraordinary character. The shadows of the surrounding trees had so darkened the place where the children stood that it was nearly impossible to discover any object at a greater distance than a couple of yards or so. All in an instant the whole scenery around them was lighted up with a bright blue light, not unlike that which bursts forth after the celebrated game of snapdragon, when the salt has been thrown into the burning raisins, and the red flame of the blazing brandy suddenly becomes blue, and turns everybody's face into a caricature by no means flattering to the personal vanity of those who undergo the operation. In like manner to this was the mountainside lighted up in the most extraordinary and unexpected manner, and the brother and sister beheld such a sight as they had never even pictured to themselves in the wildest dreams. The wood, no longer still and calm and silent in its somber grandeur, was perfectly alive with creatures, and such creatures as you would never believe to have existed unless you had actually seen them with your own eyes. One had the large head of a goat upon the diminutive body of a man, another a woman's head upon a form which appeared to be that of a cat. One, apparently human, was all body, with a head no bigger than a marble, another had a head rather larger than common, with a body only 2 or 3 inches in length, so that his beard draggled on the ground. One had legs like pins, a second had no legs at all, a third was noseless, and a fourth had his head on wrong side foremost. Most of them squinted, none were anything near the ordinary height of even a short man, and upon the faces of all, that is of those who had faces sufficiently human to enable one to judge of the matter, was a weird, strange, uncanny expression, whilst their eyes glistened and shone like glowworms in a dark night, or a gleam of sunshine through the chink of a door, or a red-hot coal in a glowing fire, or like anything else which expresses a sharp, piercing, twinkling eye, which, multiplied manyfold, and glaring upon you unexpectedly from all sides, is not precisely calculated to inspire the heart with confidence, the mouth with words, or the spirit with joy. So indeed our young travelers found it, and were astonished beyond measure, as well as to some extent alarmed, at the curious company in which they found themselves. Lionel, however, threw his left arm round his sister's waist, and drawing her to him, prepared to defend her, if necessary, against any danger which might threaten. Then again the loud, shrill, mocking laughter ran along the mountainside, as if all the beings around the children, whoever or whatever they were amazingly delighted at something which had just happened, or was immediately about to happen. It died away presently, in a faint cadence, like the end of a tune played by a particularly disagreeable organ in the streets, and for an instant all was again silent. For an instant only, however, and then there came bounding into the bed of the torrent, and stood before the brother and sister, a figure more strange and marvelous than any they had yet seen. Its head was the head of a man, with frizzly and very bright red hair sticking up all round, as if its owner had just been awakened out of sleep by a dream or vision so terrible as to make his hair stand on end with affright. One of his eyes was apparently the eye of a boiled fish, at least it had exactly that white, dried-up look, which made it difficult to suppose that it could easily be of any use to him. The other eye seemed to be set sideways in its socket, and reached halfway down his cheek, presenting the most hideous and grotesque appearance. His nose was very wide and flat, his mouth remarkably broad, and the ears on either side of his head stood up as high, for all the world, as if they were the ears of a donkey. But, although it was beyond all doubt the head of a man, the neck was as evidently the neck of a bird, being covered with feathers, as long again as a man's neck would have been, and connected with a body which it is almost impossible to describe. It was the body of an animal, and of an animal with a tail, too, but whether the scaly skin with which it was clothed might be more properly said to belong to a fish or a beast of the hippopotamus tribe was a question not to be easily solved. The tail would incline one to the beast theory, though it was certainly a strange kind of beast at best, and the legs which supported the body seemed of so flexible a nature, and endowed with such extraordinary powers of contraction or expansion according to the caprice of their owner, that they really seemed to be made of India rubber. But the marvelous thing about the whole figure was that it was quite transparent. You could see through it, through head, neck, body, and legs, and yet you could perfectly well distinguish its outline, form, and features. All seemed shadowy, yet all was sufficiently clear to be seen, and the air of mingled subtlety and malignity which sat upon its features was but too perceptible to our hero and heroine. Now, a wood on the side of a mountain is not of itself an unpleasant thing. There is much to admire in it, and whilst you can stretch your limbs as much as you like in attempting the ascent, you have the benefit and comfort of shade to protect you from the sun, and thick foliage to ward off the passing shower. But a wood on the side of a mountain is a very different thing when peopled by such creatures as those who surrounded our two travelers, in the manner in which I have described, and both Lionel and Ethel would very much rather have been upon a flat plain, without any trees at all, if they could have been without these strange and undesirable companions. Where the figure had come from, which they now saw immediately before them, was known to neither of them. He or it, whichever you please to say, bounded down into the center of the road, or rather the torrent bed, and stood regarding them for a moment without any word or gesture. Then, all of a sudden, he tossed his arms high above his head, and gave vent to a kind of sound between a whine, a laugh, a shriek, and a yell, evidently the sound of no human or ordinary being. Such arms as they were, too, which he tossed aloft. Neither more nor less, as it appeared to the astonished children, than the huge claws of a lobster, at least they looked red, and the hands seemed as like to that which I have mentioned as one thing can well be to another. After his first cry, he appeared to have come to the conclusion that it would be better to express himself in some more rational and intelligible manner, and accordingly, without more delay, the following words fell upon the ears of his disturbed and astonished hearers: "Who are ye who dare to scale mountainside and wooded glade? Bid your mortal hearts to quail. Here your progress must be stayed. To the region ye have come where I reign, by day and night, and the voice of man is dumb at the bid of mountain sprite." The extraordinary being uttered these words in a clear, shrill, ringing voice, and, drawing himself up at the same time to his full height, which might have been nearly 3 feet, looked sternly at those whom he addressed, and apparently paused for a reply. What that reply should be was a question not easily to be settled by the astonished children. The whole occurrence had been so sudden and unexpected that, to use a common expression, they hardly knew whether they were standing on their head or their heels. But it was evident that some kind of an answer was expected, and Lionel, being an English boy, and consequently not given to being afraid, plucked up spirit and answered thus: "Who are we? Why, Lionel, and Ethel Newton, to be sure, and we didn't know we were doing any harm by climbing up here." Scarcely were the words out of the boy's mouth, then again there broke forth an universal chorus of wild laughter all around, and the little figure in front leapt up at least a yard high in the air, kicked his legs right and left, after the most absurd and grotesque fashion, and, snapping his fingers madly above his head, cried out in loud tones: "He has answered! He has answered! The mortal child has spoken to the Sprite King! He is ours, she is ours, they are both ours!" And again the unearthly laughter rang along the mountainside, and died away as before in mournful cadence. And then all the fantastic figures came crowding around the brother and sister, pressing up to them on every side, and making as if they would take hold of them, and they clung closer together, and were utterly at a loss what to do or say. Suddenly a loud sound like a thunderclap re-echoed through the woods, the earth seemed to open wide immediately before them, and almost without their knowing that they had moved, they found themselves insensibly carried forward, the earth seemed to close behind them, and they were inside the mountain, shut out from the sun, and air, and trees, and away from the sight of the beautiful world outside. It was a strange place in which they found themselves. There was the same blue light which had appeared upon the mountainside, and it illuminated the vast space inside the mountain. Marvelous were the sights which it disclosed. Quantities of trees and shrubs there were, but they all seemed to be growing downwards, as if upon the earth turned upside down. Were they walking, then, on the sky? This was the first thought that passed through their brains, but it was not so by any means, or, if it was, the sky was of a novel and curious description. They trod upon a smooth and polished surface like marble, but so bright that they could see themselves in it, as in a looking-glass, and as far as they could see right and left, there seemed to be no end to it, and no valley or hill or anything to interrupt the perfect level of the marble plain. The same strange figures were capering and jabbering all around them, and the extraordinary being, who had first accosted them, and to whom all the others appeared to pay great deference, came up and spoke to them in the same voice. "Young mortals," said he, "you are now in the kingdom of the mountain sprite, and, as you may perhaps have guessed, I myself am that fortunate individual. You will now be my slaves for 100 years or so, and had better make yourselves at home without further delay. The sooner you forget your past life, the better for your future happiness. Meanwhile, lest you should not have done so already, but cherish as yet some slight remembrance of your friends on man's earth, let me set your minds at rest. They will soon forget you, for two of my most accomplished sprites, having for a time assumed your forms and appearance, have gone down to let it be generally known that you have been murdered by an old woodcutter. This is sure to be believed, and whilst it will put an end to any unpleasantness which you might feel from the belief that your friends would be uncertain as to your fate, it will also, in all probability, serve the useful purpose of getting rid of that abominable old man who is forever annoying us by chopping down trees on our outside playground. So cheer up, and be good slaves at once." There were many things in this speech which greatly afflicted both Lionel and Ethel. They didn't much like the idea of being slaves, having been educated in the popular belief that this is exactly what Britons never will be, and not knowing that this only holds good as long as Britons either remain in their own, or some other free country, or, being in a slave country, are stronger than the slave owners. No man, whether Briton or not, is ever a slave from choice, and when he has no choice, he is a slave, whether Briton or not, however much he may dislike it and deny it. And when people are captured by mountain sprites they are in an awkward position, and as likely to become slaves as anything else. But there were other things which were decidedly unpleasant in the speech to which the children had just listened. 100 years is a long time under any circumstances, and a very long time to be shut up inside a mountain. Besides, they had a certain amount of affection for their parents and family, and did not relish the prospect of being soon forgotten by them, or of their being distressed by false accounts of their murder. As soon, therefore, as the mountain sprite had concluded his speech, both the children, struck with the same thought, gave vent to the same exclamation with one voice, "We won't be slaves. Let us out," and boldly looked the transparent monarch in the face. The sprite, however, by no means angry or annoyed at this reply, burst into an immoderate fit of laughter, turning several times head over heels as he did so, as if to quiet himself by the exertion. His laughter was as usual re-echoed by his surrounding subjects, and when it had in some measure subsided, he again accosted the brother and sister in the following words, "You must be slaves, and you can't get out, so pray don't be troublesome, my young friends. Here, Mufflehausen, show these mortals the ways of the place, and let them rest a while before we give them work to do." Thus summoned, a spirit of a peculiarly repulsive aspect approached the children, having the head of a weasel, the body of a large snake, and the legs of a bird. His voice was like the shrill whistle of an engine, and pierced through the ears of those who heard him in a most painful manner. Impelled by some resistless impulse, the brother and sister followed this strange creature, and soon found that they had by no means seen all the wonders which existed upon the smooth marble plain on which they were standing. They moved very fast, and presently they came to a number of small, low cots, nicely done up, after the fashion of mortal cots, and evidently intended for people to sleep in. "Here," said, or rather whistled, Mufflehausen, "you can sleep in any of these, and the sooner you get your rest the better, for our king makes the new slaves work pretty hard, I can tell you." This was no good news to his hearers, but they were both tolerably tired, and the cots looked comfortable. So, without more ado, they each got into one, and determined that the best thing they could do would be to go to sleep. No sooner, however, had they laid themselves down with this resolution, than the cots instantly set off as hard as they could go in different directions. Lionel heard his sister call out his name, and springing up was about to jump out and see what she wanted, when he was prevented by the extreme velocity with which his cot darted off, and he could only lie down again and wonder. The cot was apparently upon wheels, or else was so constructed as to run easily upon the smooth marble, but whether it was propelled by an invisible hand, or by secret machinery, Lionel had no means of ascertaining, nor did he very much care. He felt that he was in for it, and must bear it as best he could. Neither he nor his sister had exactly such a night's rest as they could have wished. There was a good deal of noise, shrieks, laughter, howls, and sounds more or less discordant through the night, and the cots kept moving about continually as if they were alive. At last Lionel could stand it no longer, and sat up in his cot to look around him. There, close to him, was Ethel's cot perfectly still, whilst his was just passing it, and as he went by, she had just time to say to him, "Charlemagne." And then he was past. The natural thing for him to do was to say immediately to himself, "Charlemagne. What does she say that for?" And hardly were the words out of his mouth, when his cot came to a dead stop, some few yards behind that of his sister. Lionel at once got out and stood by his sister's side. "What on earth made you say that?" he asked, "and what a curious thing that it should have stopped the cots." "Yes," replied Ethel, "very curious indeed. The reason I said it was that somebody whispered it to me." "Whispered it to you?" exclaimed Lionel. "When and where, and who was it?" "Whilst my cot was going on quite fast," replied his sister, "I felt something like a bird pecking my cheek, and opening my eyes, which I had closed from sheer weariness, I saw a tiny bird, like a golden-crested wren. It had such a pretty little head, and such a pleasant look about it, and it whispered quite low to me, 'Say Charlemagne when you want to stop, and ask the king for a lemon drop.' And then it was gone in a moment." "What a very funny bird," said Lionel, "and what a queer thing to want you to say. But I don't see what you want with a lemon drop, and I dare say it was only chaff." "But," returned Ethel, "it couldn't be only chaff, or else why did the cot stop at the word the wren told me to say? But perhaps it only said that about a lemon drop for the rhyme, and at all events I don't want one just now." "Neither do I," responded the brother, "but all the same, I should like some breakfast." True enough, it was time for breakfast, but here were our two young friends in the inside of the mountain, with no apparent prospect of getting anything to eat, as far as they could see. They looked wistfully at each other, and hesitated as to what they should do. They had not long to wait, however, for several creatures of extraordinary shape and form came rushing up to them with orders that they were to come to the king. As they had evidently no choice in the matter, they at once obeyed, and on approaching the curious being who had announced to them, on the evening before, their future fate, he at once elevated his arms and snapped his fingers in the same manner. Then he made some curious passes and signs with his arms, twisted his legs about in a ridiculously absurd manner, and pronounced some words which neither Lionel nor Ethel could in the least understand. But as soon as the words were spoken, they felt all hunger pass away from them, nor did they feel hungry or thirsty again whilst they were inside the mountain. The king of the mountain sprites called to some of his attendants, directed brooms to be brought, and addressing the two children by the playful appellation of Slavikins, ordered them to sweep the marble floor, a proceeding all the more irksome because wholly unnecessary, there being apparently not one scrap of dust upon it from one end to the other. Some mysterious power, however, compelled them to obey, and thus began a life of servitude which, as far as they knew, might really continue for the time during which the mountain sprite had told them they should continue his slaves. But it is time to inquire after the fate of the innocent woodcutter. Thrust roughly into the dungeon of the old castle, he was shut out from all communication with living beings. There was a quantity of straw in one corner of his prison, and upon this the old man threw himself in utter despair. It seemed hard, very hard, that so cruel a fate should have overtaken him without any fault of his own. Still, on the whole, he thought, and thought rightly, that it was better so than if there had been fault on his part, for in that case he should have lacked the comfort which he derived from his own consciousness of being innocent. This, however, did not furnish him with any means of escape from the danger in which he perceived himself to be. There could be no doubt that the people of the place were generally convinced of his guilt. That was hard too, for they were his neighbors, who had long known him, and ought not to have been so ready to think evil of him. But so it was, and as far as he could see before him, the prospect was very dark. He would probably be dragged before the magistrate, perhaps again and again. What would be done to him he knew not, but if he escaped with his life it would be by something little short of a miracle. As he lay upon the straw, musing over all that had happened, and still almost stunned by the suddenness and severity of the misfortune which had fallen upon him, the old man cast up his eyes, and perceived that his dungeon was lighted up by a soft light, produced by the rays of the moon piercing through a slit in the wall, high above his head. This was better, anyhow, than being entirely in the dark, and although the silence was rather dull than otherwise, it was relieved by the sound of the water gurgling round the old castle walls, and seeming as if it was exploring every hole and crevice to find its way in, and murmuring gently to itself as it found the task too hard for it. So there the old man lay, quiet enough, thinking and listening and thinking, until his thoughts and attention were both turned in another direction by a very singular occurrence. In the embrasure of the wall in which was the slit, which admitted the light, there suddenly appeared something which for an instant obscured the rays of the moon. Only for an instant, however, and then it leapt lightly from its place down onto the floor of the dungeon and stood exactly in front of the prisoner. It was the figure of a woman, a little woman, a very little woman. She was dressed in feathers from top to toe, in soft brown feathers, intermixed with plumage of a brighter and variegated character which relieved the brown, and gave to her whole costume a rich and gay appearance. In height she could scarcely have reached 2 feet, the symmetry of her form was perfection itself, her face, shadowy and indistinct, had yet something at once sweet and noble in its expression which you could easily enough discern. Her hands and feet were the smallest you can imagine, and there was something about her altogether so royal and queen-like that the old woodcutter felt certain that he was in the presence of a very noble and exalted personage. She stood before him for a moment without uttering a syllable, and then, gracefully waving her hand, thus accosted the wondering old man. "Karl," she said, and her voice rang through the dungeon clear and sweet, and at the same time soft and soothing like the chimes of a church bell heard across the water upon a calm summer's evening. "Karl, cheer up. You have friends at hand." The old woodcutter was so astonished at the sight he saw and the words he heard that he could at first make no reply to his gracious speech, but, recovering himself in a few moments, he sat up upon his straw bed, and, reverently bowing his head to his visitor, responded to her salutation in the following manner: "Friends. And need enough poor old Karl has of friends, please your gracious highness's greatness's majesty. To think of such as your royalty's graciousness coming to the likes of I. But how the friends will get me out of this terrible place is more than I can guess, being but an ignorant old woodcutter." The strange visitor smiled at these words. "Does not know one's friends always in this world, good Karl," she said, "nor, for the matter of that, one's enemies either. Nevertheless, be assured that I speak the truth to you, and that you most certainly have friends. And powerful friends too, and such as will not rest satisfied until you are not only delivered from this hateful dungeon, but your innocence of the foul crime imputed to you established beyond the possibility of doubt in the open light of day." "Ah me," sighed old Karl as he heard this pleasant speech. No doubt, it can be proved if the folk will listen, but who is to prove it? And will they believe it, since they were so ready to believe against me? Is your ladyship's high mightiness able to make the neighbors believe me innocent?" "We shall see," replied the lady, with another sweet smile, and then she added, "Lest you should doubt my power, good Karl, I will tell you who and what I am, and why it is that I am here to befriend you today. Do you remember last spring, when you drove away the boys who were going to take the golden-crested wren's nest? Twice you drove them away, and the little bird hatched her young in safety. Little did you think that the good deed, which your kind heart prompted you to do, would be so soon repaid to you. Be it known to you, Karl, that upon these mountains there are 2 sorts of spirits. The mountain sprite claims the whole dominion, and indeed he is almost all-powerful in the interior of the mountains. Outside, however, it is very different, and the bird fairies dispute the supremacy with this mischievous elf. I am the wren queen, and of all the bird fairies none are so mighty as I in these parts. Now wrens never forget a kindness, and you may be sure that your kindness will not be unrewarded, therefore do not despair. Keep a light heart in your honest bosom, and before 3 days have passed over your head you shall be again a free and happy man." So saying, and without giving the old man time to reply, the wren queen lightly sprang upon the embrasure, passed through into the silent night, and left the old woodcutter alone in his dungeon alone, but no longer in the sad and despondent state in which she had found him. Hope, the brightest companion of the human heart, had newly sprung up in his breast, and although the way and time of his escape were still unknown to him, somehow or other he had the most implicit faith in the promise which had been given him by this strange visitor. So, being a man of a practical turn of mind, and moreover rather tired with the labor and excitement of the day, he turned over upon his straw bed, and fell fast asleep. In this state of blissful repose we will leave our old friend, in order to inquire into the state of things which at all this time prevailed in the village. During the whole of that day the place had been in a state of ferment and excitement, to which it was usually a stranger. People talked and gossiped, and stared and wondered, and stood about in groups, and asked one another questions, everybody earnestly seeking to obtain some scrap of information about the matter which nobody was able to afford them, because nobody knew anything about the two lost children except themselves and the mountain sprite, or some other supernatural beings. But, after all, the people really to be pitied were two individuals to whom I have scarcely yet alluded, namely, the unfortunate parents of the two lost children. Mr. and Mrs. Newton were extremely fond of their two treasures, which is not an uncommon thing with fathers and mothers, and is in fact their natural condition, unless some extraordinary reason exists for a different state of feeling. They had, therefore, been deeply distressed at the disappearance of Lionel and Ethel, and had passed an exceedingly miserable time ever since it occurred. As hour after hour passed on, and still no tidings came of the missing wanderers, the misery of the parents became almost unendurable. 1,000 times they bemoaned their hard fate, 1,000 times they repented the love of mountain and lake scenery which had tempted them from their native land, and avowed in their inmost souls that if they were but permitted to take their beloved children home again, they would never quit the safe shores of old England. Such thoughts, such regrets, such repentance, such vows were but idle and useless efforts of the perturbed mind and troubled spirit of the worthy couple, and the cause of their anguish remained unremoved and untouched. The day after their loss drew sadly to its close, and whilst the old woodcutter was sleeping calmly upon his prison bed, the unhappy Newtons knew no rest, and scarcely sought it indeed, so oppressed were they with the bitterness of their heavy grief. The next day dawned fair and mild, the sun lighted up the mountainside with his glorious rays, the birds twittered, the flowers upraised their heads newly washed and still heavy with the morning dew, the lake reflected back the sun's image from its smooth surface, and lay there calm and still in its mighty silence, and all creation appeared to rejoice and revel in the fresh strength and life of a newly born day. With slow steps and heavy hearts the poor parents walked out into the little garden between their hotel and the lake, and looked with mournful eyes upon the peaceful, happy scene before them. All was joyous, all tranquil, all lovely, but to their eyes the loveliness had lost its charm, tranquility was banished from their hearts, and joy seemed to have fled forever. Slowly and sadly they walked down to the edge of the lake, their hearts were too full for words, and they sighed deeply as they stood there together. Suddenly a sound struck upon their cars which caused them the utmost surprise, and after an instant turned the whole current of their thoughts. A clear, sweet, bell-like voice came to them, whether from lake or land they could scarcely tell, but it was easy enough to hear, and they could distinguish every syllable as distinctly as if the speaker had been one of themselves, and these were the words they heard: "Over the mountain by day and by night roameth the restless mountain sprite, woe to the maiden and woe to the child that meeteth, unaided, that spirit wild. Yet, though his might may be strange and great, oft is he checked ere he works his ends, oft has the mortal escaped his fate, spirit foes quelling by spirit friends. Cheer the sad spirit and banish fear, ill root to rest in the heart of men, and when ye welcome your children dear, bless the kind birds and the queenly wren." The voice ceased as suddenly as it had begun, and the listeners looked at each other in the greatest astonishment. Although they could not understand the exact meaning of the words, and could see nothing of the speaker, it was evident that allusion was intended to the fate of their children, and that the meaning conveyed was by no means one of an unfavorable nature. Hope revived in their breasts at once, and, moving eagerly forward in the direction from which the voice appeared to proceed, they addressed the unseen speaker in earnest accents, imploring him to tell them something more, and to disclose himself that they might thank him for the comfort which he had given them in their distress. But they might as well have spoken to the trees or stones. No one appeared, no one replied. Not a word more did they hear, and had it been only one of them who had heard the first words the other would certainly have fancied that it was only a delusion or a dream. This, however, was an idea which never entered their heads for an instant. Both had heard the voice, both had eagerly drunk in every word, and both were prepared to swear solemnly to the fact of the unseen speaker having spoken in the above manner. They felt, therefore, in spite of the silence which followed, that they had grounds for hope which they had not previously entertained, and were immeasurably relieved accordingly. Mr. Newton began to recollect all the tales which he had heard of sprites and fairies possessing power in those wild mountain regions which was denied to them in more civilized parts of the world, and although he had always been accustomed to reject such tales as idle delusions, the product of highly wrought imaginations and fanciful brains, he now began to hope eagerly that they might be true after all, and that in their truth he and his wife might find the solution of their present troubles. Cheered by the new hope which had been thus strangely awakened in their breasts, the parents passed that day with somewhat less of misery than they had previously felt since their affliction had befallen them. They sorrowed indeed, and still almost doubted the reality of the scene which had occurred at the edge of the lake, but hope, stronger than doubt, buoyed them up, and they strove to encourage each other by recalling the words which they had heard, and the confident as well as friendly tone in which they had been uttered. The day wore slowly on, and as the shades of evening began again to fall upon the shores of the lake, and still no tidings of the lost ones had arrived, hope once more grew fainter, and doubts and fears again arose with redoubled strength. Mr. Newton had inquired high and low, and had offered rewards of sufficient amount to have tempted any one in that poor neighborhood who had news to tell or information to afford. But all was useless, and when night had nearly closed in, nothing had been heard of the brother and sister, to whom it is but proper that we should now return. They had been ordered, we know, to sweep the floor of the mountain sprite's palace, if thus should be called the inside of the mountain, and felt themselves compelled to obey by some mysterious power. On and on they swept, not at all liking the work, and wishing over and over again that they were well out of the place. The matter was not improved, either, by the conduct of the strange inhabitants of the place, who kept dancing about, grinning at the children, jeering, laughing, and making remarks which were anything but polite or agreeable. There was no help for it, however, they felt themselves obliged to work on, and their only comfort was that they could do so together. But even this consolation was not long left to them. A being with a cod's head and shoulders and the body of a tortoise upon the legs of a Cochin China fowl stalked up to the two children and conveyed the king's orders that the boy Slavikin should immediately clean his boots, whilst the girl was to come and comb his hair. As the strange creature spoke, he tossed the boots to Lionel, and a curious pair of boots they were, and apparently made of eel skin, and so wonderfully slippery that he had the greatest difficulty in holding them, whilst how to clean such things he had not the least idea. So there he stood, fumbling about with the boots, not knowing what to do next, whilst his sister was led to the king, a large gold comb put into her hand, and bidden to begin to comb his hair immediately. The hair did not seem to want combing at all, and stood up so straight and stiff all round his Majesty's head that under no circumstances could much have been done with it in the way of combing. Still less when the head was never for a moment still. First it bobbed up and then it bobbed down, at one moment it nodded violently, at the next threw itself back as if intent upon breaking its neck, then it wagged vehemently from one side to the other, and all the time the face made the most extraordinary grimaces, and the eyes squinted and winked and leered in a manner perfectly outrageous. Poor Ethel could make nothing of the job, do what she would, and the attendant sprites and wonderfully shaped creatures around hooted and laughed and yelled in great amusement. At last the king jumped up, bounded away, turned head over heels, threw up his legs and cracked his fingers as usual, and declared he would have no more of it till next time. To this poor Ethel had not the slightest objection, and was beginning to move quietly away, although hardly knowing where to go to or what to do, when the king suddenly appeared to have changed his mind, for rushing back again he began to tumble about in his usual fantastic manner, and then planting himself before the child made several miraculously ugly faces in quick succession, and informed her that her next duty would be to tickle his ears with a feather. This task appeared likely to be even less easy of accomplishment than the last, unless His Majesty would keep his royal head rather more still than before, but Ethel felt some power which compelled her to attempt it, and accordingly commenced, using a feather which was handed to her by one of the attendant sprites. Vainly, however, did she strive to keep the feather on or near the king's ear. The head, as before, was never still for an instant, and, what was worse, the mountain sprite began to get cross and to abuse her for not doing her work properly. "Slavikin," he cried, "vile mortal Slavikin, you are useless and idle. Take more pains, little earth child, or you must be punished." This rather frightened Ethel, and produced no improvement in the tickling. So the king became more and more cross, and threatened her again. It was by this time late in the afternoon, and the children had now been more than a whole day and night in the heart of the mountain. Ethel looked round for her brother with some vain idea that he might come and help her, but she saw no help, and at that moment the king called out, "Bring the other Slavikin and whip him well, that will punish her," and 2 or 3 sprites immediately hurried off. Just then something lightly touched Ethel's ear, and she heard a little low, chirping whisper, which said quite clearly and quite close to her, "If he threaten but one more time, ask as I told you, but ask in rhyme." Until that moment the child had quite forgotten what had happened in the morning when her cot stopped at the mystic word, but she remembered directly she heard this voice, and determined at once to do as she was told. She had not much time to think, before she saw Lionel coming on, apparently pushed by several creatures who were crowding round behind him and urging him forward until he came close to where the king was. When he was quite near, the monarch threw up his legs and arms after his own peculiar fashion, and then said in a loud voice, "Since we can make so little of the sister, upon the brother's back we'll raise a blister, so, no delay, my sprites, the hours are jogging, give the male Slavikin a tremendous flogging." He cracked his fingers as he spoke, and in an instant the sprites around seemed ready to obey his commands, for several of them drew from their sides whips which appeared to be nothing less than live snakes, whirled them aloft in the air, and to all appearance were about to lay them smartly upon poor Lionel's back. But before a single blow could fall, Ethel interposed in great haste with a rhyme which she had been busily making ever since she had heard the voice, "Stay, sir. Before my brother thus you whop, I'll trouble you for just 1 lemon drop." The words were scarcely out of her mouth, when a piercing shriek issued from the mouth of the king, which was immediately re-echoed by all the strange beings around him. One united, simultaneous, awful yell, and the next moment all was silence. Nor did the marvel stop here. The light suddenly disappeared, and the whole interior of the mountain was plunged in darkness the most profound. At the same time the children insensibly drew close together and joined hand in hand. As they did so, they heard the gentle rustling of wings near them, and a voice whispered once more in their ears, "The spell is broken for a while, the mystic words of magic art have freed ye from the spirit's guile, then haste, oh, haste ye, to depart." This time the voice was easily heard by both brother and sister, and they were quite ready to profit by the advice which it gave. It is difficult, however, to walk in the dark, and they would hardly have known what to do, if an invisible hand had not laid hold of each of them and guided them forward. They had not far to go, and in one moment, when they least expected it, a door seemed to open before them, and they stepped out upon the side of the mountain. Ah, what a glorious, happy change from that terrible and wonderful place from which they had just emerged. The pure air of heaven kissed their cheeks, the beautiful green trees waved over their heads, the blue sky hung in serene majesty overhead, and they realized in that one moment how lovely and marvelous is the world in which the great Creator has placed his mortal children. There was something unusual, too, on the mountainside. Above, around, on each side, everywhere, were myriads of wrens, chirping and singing joyously, and flying from bush to bush with evident delight. It was impossible to mistake their carol of joy, and still more so when amongst them appeared a figure which I need scarcely describe to any one who remembers the little lady who visited old Karl in his lonely dungeon. She it was, and she sweetly smiled on Lionel and Ethel as she spoke to them in the following words, "By fairy will and wrenish might have ye escaped the mountain sprite. Now bide no longer on the hill where such have power to work you ill. Haste to your parents. Tarry not, nor let old Karl be quite forgot." She spoke, and as she did so, pointed to the path which led down the mountainside, which the brother and sister began immediately to descend. Before they had gone 2 steps, however, the same thought struck both of them at the same time, and they turned round together, saying, "Oh, lady, how shall we ever thank you enough for—" But here they suddenly stopped, for they were speaking to empty space. In 1 second, lady, wrens, and every living creature had disappeared, and all seemed as quiet and natural as if such things as wrens and mountain sprites had never existed. Much surprised, and not without a certain amount of dread, the children delayed no longer, but hurried as fast as they could down the mountain to the village. Curiously enough, they thought they had only been 1 day and 1 night in the interior of the mountain, but we who know what had happened since their disappearance are aware that they must have been there more than double that time. For, as far as I can make out, though people differ so in their account of the same things that it is almost impossible to discover the real truth about them, Mr. and Mrs. Newton must have been at least 2 nights without news of their children, including that which preceded the afternoon of their disappearance, and old Carl, as we know, having been arrested on the day after, had passed the second night in his dungeon. Therefore, as near as I can tell, Lionel and Ethel must have been, say from Monday evening until Wednesday evening in the kingdom of the mountain Sprite, and I am not quite sure whether it was really Wednesday or Thursday upon which they got out. I like to be particular, but after all it does not much signify now that we know they did get out, and what is more, that they got safely down from the mountain into the village. Their appearance there created the greatest surprise. Some people screamed, some fainted, some ran away, but the greater part surrounded them with shouts of joy and eager inquiries as to where they had been and what had been the cause of their absence. Being but imperfectly acquainted with the language of the country, neither Lionel nor Ethel was able to satisfy their questions, but, surrounded by the eager crowd, they made the best of their way to the hotel at which their parents were staying, and arrived there just as the latter, having partaken of a melancholy dinner, were standing upon the balcony, and looking with sad and wistful gaze towards the mountains which seemed to have swallowed up their treasures. They heard the loud shouts of the approaching villagers, and although the night was closing in too fast to allow of the objects before them being distinctly visible, the mother's instinct soon told her the truth, and in a very few moments a meeting took place which can be better imagined than described. Neither is it necessary to relate the particulars of the scene which followed, though you may be sure it was one of general rejoicing, who is by far the best general I know. Both Lionel and Ethel had, as you may suppose, much to tell, although with all that they could relate they were unable to satisfy the curiosity of their parents. There was something else to think of, however, besides curiosity. As soon as the first feeling of joy at the children's return had begun to subside in the bosoms of the honest villagers, there came upon them a deep and just feeling of shame at their abominable behavior to poor old Carl. Nor were they slow to act upon their changed disposition. They hurried off to the mare to obtain the requisite authority, and then descended in a body to the lake, and crowded up to the gates of the old castle. When the keeper knew their errand, and was assured of the entire innocence of his prisoner, he very soon admitted them to the dungeon in which the old woodcutter was confined. With cries of joy and enthusiasm, they dragged the good man from his couch of straw, and conducted him to the open air, everybody telling him the good news at the same time, and nearly deafening his venerable ears with their clamor and confusion. He bore it all with great tranquillity, and evinced but little gratitude for the kindness of those who had been so ready to desert and even to assail him when he had most wanted their aid. But he was truly glad when they brought him to his cottage, and his true old wife met him with open arms and streaming eyes, and the villagers had the good sense and good taste to leave the worthy old couple alone, to enjoy their newly recovered happiness. Next day, too, brought an addition to their contentment, for Mr. and Mrs. Newton paid their cottage a visit, accompanied by Lionel and Ethel. They spoke kindly to the old woodcutter and his wife, told them how grieved they were at the trouble which had so undeservedly fallen upon them, and made them such a handsome present that Carl declared he thought he should never need to go woodcutting again. I do not think, however, that he kept to this resolution, for I heard of an old man very like him who was engaged in the same business the last time I was in that neighborhood, and a man who has been used to hard work and plenty of exercise all his life is not wise to give it up all at once, even if he be able to do so. So perhaps Carl still works on that mountain, though Ethel Newton, who told me the story, did not know for certain. She did know, though, that she and her brother and father and mother came safely home, and that they have never visited the same place again. But ever since that time, the wren has been a sacred bird in the Newton family. If a wren was to come and ask for her most precious possession, says Ethel, she would give it directly, and she is quite safe in saying so, since there is not the smallest probability that a wren would ever do anything of the sort. Still, Ethel and all the family are quite right to be grateful to the Wren Queen, and to be partial to wrens in general, and I can only hope that if any of my readers get into such difficulties as those which befell Lionel and his sister, they may find as powerful a friend to aid them as the brother and sister found when in the kingdom of the mountain Sprite.